Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our conversation panel. And today's panel, we are featuring two people who will be with me speaking, like Kanaga Sabapathy. Thank you. And also Charlene Rajendran. So maybe I'll just introduce them very briefly before I talk a little bit about the theme of today's panel. So I think Kanaga Sabapathy needs no introduction. He is, I think, by all accounts, as we can agree, probably the most eminent art historian in Southeast Asia. He is attached to National University in Singapore, so he's all the way coming here from Singapore, as is Charlene as well. And earlier this year, there was a book that was published by NUS called Writing the Modern, which you can find at the marketplace in the main building. And that is a selection, a very small selection of not even 10% of the corpus of Kanaga's writings on art. So that's Kanaga, and then we have Charlene, who is currently assistant professor at Nanyang Technological University, also in Singapore, so she's also here from Singapore, although she's Malaysian. And she's a theatre educator, a researcher, practitioner, writer, performer, director, and also a dramaturg. And she, together with myself and another editor, Ken Takiguchi, who's not with us, basically we also co-edited a book called Excavations, Interrogations, Krishen, and Modern Contemporary Malaysian Theatre, which is also available in the marketplace. And that is a book about the late Krishen, a book in response to a conference on the late Krishen Jit's theatre practice. So those are the two books that actually came out earlier this year, sometime I guess in January or February. And partly is the impetus for our panel today, since this festival is about writing, and we realized that there's not a lot of discussion about a specific area of writing, which is writing about the arts. And in particular, in our case, for our two books will be theatre as an art form and also the visual arts. So basically how I'm going to do the panel is I'll start off with a few questions. It will be pretty informal. I'll ask some questions, we'll have a conversation, and then gradually I'll bring you in. So if you have any burning questions, don't wait till the end. You can raise your hand and I'll include you as early as possible. So we hope that this will be a good dialogue, and as there are many of you in the room who are either writing, interested, or practitioners of the arts, so I'm hoping that this will be productive for all of us.
Can I just also introduce Carmen Ng? Because she is an arts writer and a theatre writer and an academic and somebody who is very much part of the discussion rather than someone who's just going to be a moderator effaced into the background. So Carmen, you're an important part of this, and I think we want to acknowledge that, so that those of you who have read Carmen's writing, including a very recent, very well-written review of Writing the Modern on Arts Equator website, you will know of Carmen as well. So in that sense, this is a threesome rather than 2+1. I just want to add to that.
Okay, thank you, Charlene. I always forget to introduce myself, so yeah, thanks. Okay, so we'll start off with a very simple but potentially complex question, which is for both of you to address the question of what do you think makes a good arts writer? You know, what might be some of the qualities of a good arts writer? And for Kanaga, in particular, as you are an art historian as well, do you think there's a particular approach, effective or better approach to write on the visual arts that might be informed by history? As an art historian, do you think that gives a different lens to arts writing? Or are there any historical types of strategies that might be useful to be employed when writing about the arts? And maybe for Charlene to talk a little bit also about, because Charlene did her PhD on Krishen Jit, so if you can also talk a little bit about Krishen's writing for the newspapers, particularly when he was, during the time when he was writing the most about theatre in Malaysia. We can start.
Okay. What are the qualities, characteristics, what is needed? That I will I will say some things about it in a very roundabout way, otherwise it may appear as if I'm offering a recipe on how to write. I know that this question is asked and will continue to be asked, and it's necessary to ask it. Can I preface the whole thing by remarking on the following, which is deeply felt? It is immensely apt to have this panel in Penang for me. Writing on the modern, for me, began in Penang, and especially since my appointment at the University Science Malaysia in 1972. So if you'll bear with me, I will try to talk about your question by interweaving a number of biographical strands. When I reached Penang to teach, I had no interest in the modern at all. My entire scholarship, both at the undergraduate, graduate student level, as well as a kind of a nuclear teaching levels, were completely immersed in the grand art historical traditions of Southeast Asia, the Hindu-Buddhist particularly. And those of us who were nurtured in that milieu, the modern was unthinkable, was just not there. There was the great grand tradition, and then nothing. The scholarship on that field perpetuated that view. There was a great divide. And it's not just particular to the study of Asian art traditions. It was the case worldwide. And when we were in Penang, we were subtly and not so subtly informed that we're not really interested in faraway times. We want to know about where we are now. And so the history of art really is not the history of the modern. That's a very new entity. And I dare say it is the case in other fields as well. This was somewhat startling, and there was a huge scramble amongst just one or two of us to cobble together a syllabus, a curriculum to teach the modern. And that began in 1975, 3 years after my appointment. And as my involvement with the modern increased, by initially necessity and then by commitment and subsequently conviction, the grand tradition began to recede in interest. And in truth, I have not written on it at all over the last 35 years. But, I never ever abandoned it in terms of the practice of art history, the discipline of art history, for which there was nothing tangible with respect to the modern outside Europe. So the initial attempts was really to graft certain aspects of the method, the system, the approach, the perspectives from the older art history to the modern. Elsewhere in a publication, I think I have said rather plaintively that I write on the modern while yearning for the past. And I think I still do. Not the past as something that is dead and gone, but very much alive. And if you ever visit my home and look at the books that I have, I think about 75 to 80% is still to do with the great tradition. So my question will have to be deeply and uninhibitedly prejudiced, the answer to your question. That I would say that one of the principal fueling interests and capacities to write on the visual arts is a knowledge of art history. I don't think it is an exaggerated claim. The terminology is derived from history of art. Much of the methodology continues to be derived from the history of art. And the end results, the outcomes of such exegeses, such explications, are still comparable to how art history is written. Having said that, I will also say that it is through the writing of the modern that radical revisions of the earlier art histories are being conducted, are being undertaken. And I don't think this is particular to the domain of art, that it is in the involvement in the modern, inasmuch as it is the involvement in the contemporary that is affecting the writing on the modern. And I have citations for that shortly. I have brought along not the two publications that Carmen mentioned. I will not deal with them, I will let others, but an earlier one on Krishen, which is a collection of his, or a selection of writings by him, called Krishen Jit, An Uncommon Position. And I want to illustrate certain characteristics, certain drives, certain motivations in wishing and wanting to write. The second matter, again on a little bit on the nostalgic trip, is, and I talked about this with Marian over the dreaded email. This is something very strange about. This is the very first platform convened in which I am with Krishen. It may sound ghoulish that we are commemorating Krishen and I am here celebrating this pairing. I have been with him publicly, but always introducing him or fleetingly commenting on something, but never sitting down and talking about our respective fields of writing. Can I take a break from there and then come back to your question a little later on? Because otherwise I'll be perennially digressing, which is a wonderful thing, of course. Some of the greatest things that are written are digressions. Charlene, my love, it's all yours.
Okay, let me begin by saying it's a very deep honor to be on this little platform with Kanaga and Carmen, talking about Kanaga's writing, talking about Krishen's writing. And so, yeah, let me just put that out there. I'm going to say a little bit about my observation or ideas in relation to Krishen's writing. And I think one of the things that makes Krishen such an important writer, not just a good writer, is an insatiable love and curiosity about words and about language and about how words and language can be played with, are sensuous, meaningful and provocative, and the containers in some ways of certain kinds of ideas and how those ideas can be evoked and therefore put out there. But more than that, this capacity to play with language and with words. And in thinking about it for this event, it struck me that when Krishen decided that his column would be called Talking Drama with Ute or by Ute, he then decided he would not just write as Krishen Jit, but he would write as a character from a play. So for those of you who are unaware, Ute is a character from a play written by the National Laureate Usman Awang, the late Usman Awang. The play is called Udadandara. And in this play, Udadandara, Ute is a somewhat eccentric older man who comments on life, and very often people don't understand him. But nonetheless, they have very high regard for Ute. So Krishen then is, in some ways, playing with the idea that Ute is speaking, although people knew it's Krishen who's writing the column in the New Sunday Times on performance, on culture in relation to performance, on policy in relation to performance making. This column is the longest standing column that has ever run from 1972 to 1994, with a short break in between when Krishen went off for his sabbatical to New York in 1980. And I think he played with the column, he played with words, he played with writing, with a very serious intent to discover, to find out, and to give himself a certain kind of facility and literacy, maybe, because he was not, very unlike Kanaga, schooled in theatre or theatre history. His formal training was as a historian. And if you read the Excavations book, the tales that Kanaga tells about their time in Berkeley, California, is when Krishen and Kanaga meet. Kanaga learning art history and Krishen looking at American history. So he's trained as a historian who then comes to theatre because of a love for the arts and theatre, and steeped in a kind of humanities way of looking at the world, perhaps, literature, history, those kinds of things. And in a compilation of his writings that was translated into Malay and published by the Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka called Membesar Bersama Theatre, which was a title Krishen chose from the book, he writes in the introduction about how writing enabled him to find out about performance and performance making and writing about performance. So I think this insatiable love and curiosity about words is one important characteristic for someone who wants to write about something that actually cannot be contained in words. I mean, a performance lives very differently from words on a page. So that work of communicating something about performance and performance making and the watching of performance, and choosing a medium in which there is a kind of finality to it. Once the words are printed, it's there. Completely unlike live theatre, in which it's no longer there after it's performed. A video, a film is not the live performance. Then means that there is a conscious desire to make something happen through writing that extends, deepens, spins, provokes something else which is impossible without that writing, in a way. What that is, of course, is another kind of discussion. So I think I'll just...
Thank you. I can now go on with the question, having heard Charlene, which is, of course, central and almost defining, which is language. And in talking on that, she used a very critical term to link the relationship between language and the thing that is being taught, which is the performance or the theatre. And likewise, for me, it's the work of art. And you use the word about. I think this is what we do. It's to talk about the aboutness. It's never to talk directly of it. You can't, unless you are creating something yourself. Of course, those of us who write on history of art criticism, we like to imagine that we are also creative. I sometimes slip into those illusory bubbles and then quickly come out of it when I read aloud what I have written. And I have developed that habit over the last 10 to 15 years. I deal with that. But when I began to study art history, the enrollment was such that you enrolled for a major and then 2 or 3 minors, and art history was a minor. This was in 58. And on that placard, it says 2 things as inducement. You do not need to draw or paint. And I suffered from that, and I still suffer from that throughout in writing on art. And secondly, and this is crucial to what you say, a love of language. A love of language. And I thought, oh, that's okay, I can cultivate that. And sure enough, when we walked into the lecture hall and heard our instructor, I knew why, because the way he delivered it, lights are dimmed if you have ever attended a lecture on art, and the work of art is the image that is projected onto the wall. And one talks to the wall and from the wall back to the audience. So this is the dynamic of it. And there he sat and for 50 minutes talked on, about, around, over. And we were transported to another realm altogether. It was all through language. So if you ask, what is it? Then there has to be a deep commitment to and a conviction in the use and the capacity of language to elicit certain relationships and to enliven and vivify those relationships to a prospective reader and audience in such a way that when reading it, that person could either visualize, picture, reimagine what is being talked about, what is seen, and what is shown. And in that capacity, it's the ability to describe. I know this is not a very favorable term used these days. Descriptive prose is some kind of degenerate prose. You know, which is unfortunate. I think description is extremely vital. We camouflage what we write with sort of underhanded descriptions anyway. Descriptions sort of slip in and slip out. But descriptions are ways of reincarnating relationships between entities, whether they are actual, physical, experiential entities or imagined entities. And that is darn difficult, man, to forge relationships and to forge them in a dynamic and in a felt way. So that's if you're talking about what might be needed, one is a commitment to the thing that one is wanting to see and talk about. Here I will talk about the artwork. And this too is a little bit fraying at the moment. So much of writing on artwork skips and slides and elides the artwork, and perhaps you don't need the artwork to talk about art. it's come to that point, which is I'd like to think, a transcendental position, but I've yet to be transported transcendentally in reading these kinds of sort of escapist explications. So the relationship between language, because this is the apparatus that we have, and to recognize also that perhaps there's a limit to which you can press language in order to elicit the life of something else. And this is where we can knock on the doors and say we are somehow on the threshold of wanting to be creative, because creative writing also has to do with the conspicuous understanding of either a desired or a dreaded silence, the unspeakable and the unsayable. I haven't come to that yet, but those I think are the two. To see, to look, unendingly, unceasingly, and unflaggingly. There must be interest in that thing, which is the artwork, to me. And this is what I try to convey to my students as well, who balk at it because there's no time to look at these things. Added to the question of language is to of course, writing implies reading. No, that's the other difficult, complicated matter. May I say a little bit about what I think? When I'm writing, I have both general and specific readers in mind. The general is the audience for which the writing has been commissioned for. The specific are individuals whom I have in mind, whom I would like to read what I have written, and many times this doesn't happen. And the other is to have certain writers in mind. I'm writing with and against others who happen to be in my constellation, not for the month, but for the last 2 or 3 years that I have been developing. You're always haunted by things that already have been written, and you're writing with others, other texts in mind, other writers in mind, other voices in mind. And these are extremely tangible and real presences. In the first 15, 20 years, earlier we were in a panel where a writer was talking about, do you get so-and-so to read? My first reader for a long, long time was Dory, my wife, who was also my editor, and she was a hell of a severe editor. And every time I submitted to her, I felt that I was a failure in my writing. And every time she read my writing and then I submitted it, I knew it would be faultless. Because I could blame her, I guess. I don't know. No, but truly. So you had specific writers in mind, and I happen to have a domestic critic. Someone who was living with me, who was just there. But then there were others. So that's a third component in this cartography, in this sort of map of writing. Who are your readers? A good colleague of mine reminded me once, Kanaga, when you've completed a manuscript, send it to the person who hates you most to read it. Unfortunately, in our art world, we do not have such passionate distancing at all. We just have minor estrangements or passing indifference, but not really deeply held schisms. Which is terrible. Really, it is really is terrible. Why do we write at all? Well, I have answers to that. Okay, go ahead. You have something to say?
Yes, I mean, thanks for the nice segue there, because it might be a useful bridge, I think, to talk a little bit about art criticism or theatre criticism versus arts writing. Since you evoked the spectre of the enemy or the hater, because when you criticize, you do take on a role where you pass judgment or you're giving some kind of evaluation which may or may not be positive, right? And wondering whether there needs to be a kind of differentiation between these two types of role, whether art critic, if there is a difference in your mind between an art or theatre critic versus just an art or theatre writer, if you see what are the differences, if any, but also to go back a little bit to what you mentioned earlier, Kanaga, about you can't draw or you can't paint, right? Could that be why you are a better art historian? I mean, in the sense that if you were yourself an artist, would that make it hard for you to step out of your own practice to then reflect on it in a different way, and maybe to vis-a-vis Krishen, who is a practitioner writing about the arts, and his own art practice vis-a-vis other theatre practitioners, right? Because I notice in terms of Krishen and Kanaga, you're coming in from different kind of strands. Krishen is like an insider writing as an insider. Kanaga, you're more of a outsider sort of insider, but definitely not an artist writing sort of a little bit on the outside, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so this issue about Krishen being a performance maker and being a critic and arts writer is something that has come up before, and I don't think there's a definitive on it, clearly. Krishen made certain choices never to write about a Five Arts Centre production. A Five Arts Centre was the company that Krishen co-founded with Marion de Cruz, K.S. Maniam, Chin San Sui, and Reza Piadasa in 1984. And he made certain choices to avoid, I suppose, writing about people who associated very clearly with this company and making work for the company. Nonetheless, there were questions about his capacity to be distant and objective and all these things that a theatre critic is supposed to be. And that allows me to connect to your earlier question, this difference allegedly between the critic and the writer. I think a lot depends, this is for me personally, I'm not speaking about Krishen's views here, depends on the larger industry that exists or doesn't exist about theatre writing, say. And there are, to my knowledge, no theatre critics that are hired by a particular organization, whether it be a website or a newspaper or any other publication for that matter, whose sole job it is to watch performance and be the writer who reviews those performances. There's nobody who's doing that. So in that sense, if you compare it to a critic who's writing for The Guardian in the UK, whose sole job it is to watch performances every day and then decide what he or she is going to write about, there aren't critics of that ilk. And they have not sharpened their tools for being a critic because that's not the industry in which they operate. So therefore, there are people who write reviews, and there are people who write previews, and there are people who write articles about performance and performance makers and performance making. And sometimes these include practitioners themselves. And it depends on what kind of writing one is expecting. So if I look at Krishen as an example in relation to Ute, his voice changed. And there were times he was writing about, for example, why people who don't understand Cantonese should go and watch Cantonese opera. Because this is a way of engaging with a traditional art form that an English language speaking person who's reading the New Sunday Times on Sunday to get a little bit of culture is something that that person is probably unlikely to do. So Krishen is then motivated clearly by something he is thinking about in relation to culture, nation, society, what is Malaysian, what is traditional, what is contemporary, to say at the end of that particular column, so if you don't, something to the effect of, so if you don't speak Cantonese, go try it out. Go watch Cantonese opera, all right? Compared to when he's writing about a performance that frustrates him, and he feels the artists have not taken on the rigor of performance making, the rigor of thinking through what they're doing. They have not taken on the opportunity to look at what's happening regionally, and he makes many comparisons between what's happening in Indonesia, for example, and the experimentation in Indonesia with what is happening in, I wouldn't say so much Malaysia as much as KL specifically, right? Not fair. And there he's writing about experimentation and the importance of artists really thinking deeply through what they're doing, in which the reader, who is generally not the artist, I mean the majority not the artist, is then witnessing a kind of perhaps rebuke, you might call it, from Pak Ute to these younger, newer artists. And so I think in the case of Krishen and the column, there were many voices that he was cultivating in order to do different things and in order to evoke different kinds of responses. In that sense, he was a theatre writer or performance writer even, you know, because it was not just theatre. He was also writing about dance. He was writing about readings of poetry and new writings that were happening in Abad Century Hotel, for anyone who remembers that hotel in KL in the 1970s. Helen remembers. And he was thinking about ways of being and becoming in relation to this notion of Malaysia that was being constructed. And for him, it was via the framework of performance where that could happen. So I think that this notion of a critic, the critic, is one that relates largely to the larger industry in which that person is operating and how that person is positioned. And thus, the authority that is accorded to a certain voice, that means that you know when you are reading or writing it, you are operating from this position or positionality, I think.
What I could comment on both Charlene's recollections and your question is to perhaps propose that to talk about varieties of writing on art. You mentioned one to do with criticism and then art writing, which you can then assume all kinds of declensions to art writing and subcategorize them, is to assume that there is a recognizable professionalization on writing, that there is a status for it, and there is room for it. You talk about a regular column and therefore a regular columnist. I'm not saying that there is absolutely no professionalization, but I think if we want to claim that, it is not possible to claim it consistently. It's not possible to survey the field of writing on art in, let's say, Malaysia or Southeast Asia, when there are parallels between the various locations over the time that we are talking about, which is the modern and the contemporary. And when there are individuals who appear, they they appear temporarily and then they slip away. And even when they register their thoughts, it may not be sufficiently entrenched to take hold. You mentioned talking drama with Ute or by Ute, which, by the way, appeared in the New Sunday Times in 72, October, concurrently with one on the art scene by Retsa Piyadasa. They appeared at the same time. And I think Retsa continued for a little bit longer than Krishen. And these were the two which appeared in the English language medium. Were there comparable ones in, say, in Bahasa Malaysia and in Chinese? I doubt very much. There were the occasional ones. And if one drew the net a little bit wider to include Southeast Asia, let's say in Singapore, Indonesia. In Indonesia, I know there is a column, and there has been a column, and a revered and a much respected column in Tempo, which was seen as the principal window through which one talked about. The Bangkok Post had writers coming in and leaving. Manila Times had two. Sid Reyes was one who commented, and then Rod Paras Perez also commented for about 5 or 6 years concurrently. All at about the same time. This is interesting. All appeared in the 70s. And it would be interesting to try and answer your question, Carmen, which we are not able to now, unless, of course, sorry, Serena, I'm going to mention you. Serena Abdullah has, I think, written the only paper that I know on this subject, which she has published, and I urge you to read it, on art criticism and art writing, the very subject that you talk about. And, of course, her focus was on Malaysia, but some of the principles or perspectives I'm articulating are things which she has discussed with greater rigor and linguistic elegance in her paper than I'm able to muster here. But a survey would, I think, provide wonderfully illuminating insights, which we have not done yet. What is the nature of varieties of writing on art and writing on theater, since we are dealing with the two conjointly at the moment, at the years that we are referring to. Even as we were talking about writing that is critically oriented, which is contingent to an event, to an episode, to something that is happening, which is the art exhibition, the theater performance, the musical performance, which is the business of criticism. And we must admit, whether we like it or not, the business of criticism is to pass as severe a judgment as possible at the end of it, whether it is good or bad, which none of us like hearing. But there it is. That's the purpose of criticism, and this is why criticism is reviled. In any instance, nobody likes to be told you are bad or you're good. You don't mind being told you're good, I guess. But that's the main purpose. And of course, to substantiate that judgment with as deep a knowledge as possible, and that's the expectation, and that the depth of that knowledge is then distilled in the criticism. It is not overlaid on the criticism so that the criticism then is diluted. Then it's not good criticism. At least in the media, which is, and that's another matter. Elsewhere we may say critics make or break. Has anyone been broken or made in our midst? I don't know. I don't know. There were tremors that whenever Retsa Piyadasa said something, there were about 72 knives drawn waiting to plunge into him. But I don't think he ever drew 1 ounce of blood at any time. But And did it matter for the sort of viewership? Did it matter for the visitorship? Did it matter for the box office? Or are we talking about criticality and the critical atmosphere which need not and cannot be measured in these terms, which complicates matters even more? And I think the latter probably is the case. Does criticism matter? I think it does. And how may it be made to care is for it to be talked about, thought about, referred to, bandied about. Has that happened? I think it has happened informally. And because it has happened informally, it has not been registered. And those who remember are increasingly fewer in number. Those who are alive and well don't remember. So we have a great, wonderful, not schism, but chasm, which is another matter altogether. But just to round that off from my point of view, for me, it has always been, I have written in the newspaper for many, many years in Singapore, and I've never, ever been comfortable with it. Not because I find the newspaper column cramped and cribbing, it is, but I was never comfortable in being able to make this kind of once and for all judgment call. As a historian, one balks at that, which may be why historians are out of favor now, because you can't rely on them for anything. They are sort of toing and froing in all kinds of places. I don't know. But historians take an immeasurably long time to come to a judgment. Because I haven't quite looked at this, I haven't quite looked at that, I haven't quite looked at that. So for me, there was this, although some say that I have made some rather cruel judgments, but there you are, which highlights for me a certain crisis in various types of writing in my own life. Writing that is overtly critical and writing that is, how shall I say, widely historical in nature. And I still hold that there is a difference between the two.
I'm going to ask you how you deal with it. Because you write about the visual arts and you write about theatre, and you sometimes write an essay for an art catalogue, and you sometimes write a preview, and you sometimes write a review, and
okay, might be useful in terms of my own trajectory. I used to write previews when I was what we call a noob writer, like a green writer. So previews were easier because you just basically got a lot of facts. My general rule of thumb is I never write art criticism. I mean, I never criticize an artist. Maybe it's a cultural thing, but people don't like it when you criticize them, and then word gets around, and then people basically don't want you to write about them at all. So I just try to avoid that. But for art catalogues, I think art exhibition catalogues for me are the only area where it is possible to be critical, not in a judgmental way per se, but critical of, let's say, the genealogy of a work, or how the work gets created, or what are the artist's motivations, because part of the art exhibition catalog writing experience involves meeting the artist, talking to the artist. I usually spend like hours, sometimes days with the artist. So in a way, you develop a kind of relationship of trust, sort of, where if you were to write anything deemed critical, we as writers, we might not feel we're critical, but people might feel that way. I generally feel that artists are more generous when they feel you have given the time to reach out and understand them. I think the difficulty is if you're an arts critic but you don't know people, you just go in, watch something, you're anonymous, you go home and you hack it out. People get angry. And I kind of understand that because they don't know where you're coming from. So if you have that kind of extra connection, I think it's a little bit easier. Of course, some personalities are more sensitive than others, so preferably those should be avoided. But I find that generally younger artists, they are much more open to criticisms, and if you've talked to them, then they feel like your opinion is valid because you have talked to me. So you don't agree with me, that's fine. But if you haven't talked to me, then it becomes a kind of your view may not be the right view or not be in tune with how they think. So generally that's my general principle. But I don't really write a lot of theatre reviews, so it's very hard to say. And I'm picky, so I only choose those that I already like so that I can then write about them. So that's the strategy, yes.
Before we leave, there was one other sub matter that you raised in your question about the relationship between practice and writing. Whether you didn't say it this way, whether a practitioner, that is to say, a practitioner of creative work, would ideally make the best commentator, critical commentator or writer. And conversely, therefore, someone like me, a writer on art who has no practice, therefore is handicapped, and therefore can only operate on a secondary level, or something like that. Of course, this used to be, and in some quarters was a sort of moot point, yeah, to talk about that those who write are failed practitioners. That used to be one remark, yeah. And I think it was Tolstoy in a grumpy mood. He probably was grumpy for a long time, but in a grumpy mood said that don't believe writers on art. They're writers on art, because they are just conveying their deep, undiminished frustration in not having written. So this is their act of revenge, and so on and so forth. My view is that, especially when it comes to, say, the writing of something like history or theoretical treatises, I don't think so. I don't think there is a necessary and defining relationship between the two. Because the demands of writing historically, the demands of writing theoretically, and the demands of writing critically in the sustained and convicted sense is not necessarily defined by the immersion in practice. It is the capacity to, as you say, talk about practice, and therefore to exercise a degree of distance. At which point, if you are a practitioner, in all probability, you have to forget being a practitioner in order to enter into this other incarnation as a writer. This does not mean that those who are not practitioners and who are writers from day one cannot know about practice. And in fact, we spend a lot of time getting to know practice and getting to know practitioners. It is in the nature of the writing on the modern and the contemporary in our midst where we are, where most writers have to embark on lengthy, arduous fieldwork, because the data is not there. You got to go get the data. And one of the resources for that data is, as you say, going to the studio of the artist, the atelier of the artist, and talking with the artist. And so many of my publications have lengthy conversations with artists embedded as part of the literature on it. Having said that, what does one do with what artists say in one's writing? If the purpose is to say that, my students also say, I wish I knew what the artist said. And then I say, what are you going to do with what you know? So, well, if the artist does not know, who does? I say, you. That's why you are there. Oh no, And so then what the artist says becomes the surrogate voice for you. Do you withdraw? Do you suspend your voice, and then the voice of the artist takes over, and then you come in as an aside, and then surreptitiously and reconnect and go on with the story as if what the artist says didn't take place in the first instance. So practice then becomes intricately interwoven in this. The point is to not be starry-eyed and not to be seduced or not to be inhibited or not to be kidnapped by the artist, and therefore you lose your way. It's a tough, in that sense, writing on the modern and the contemporary, keeping the artist in mind, keeping practice in mind, is no easy caper. It's a tough call, having to skip between one and the other, embroil the two. If we reverse the thing, does a practitioner necessarily veer towards writing? I don't think so. I don't think many are comfortable, many want to. It doesn't mean that they're illiterate. It doesn't mean that, and if they are illiterate, it's a kind of feigned illiteracy, because I think it's good. They may be ignorant, but that's another matter. That's a thing to be coaxed and cajoled out of the conversations. But the relationship, I think, is an interesting one. It's an extreme, especially in writing on the present. Can I just do two things? That's why I brought this book. We talked about language, and I said something about the constant wrestle with language and the joy of striking on a lovely paragraph, which then is etched in. And to me, that's the end of the day. Then I can come back. I want to enjoy the rasa of that moment, And Krishen, as you say, and I have marked out. So yeah.
So maybe while Kanaga is looking for the page, I'll just say we were told that we have to wrap up soon.
Yeah.
So I'll let you read that, and we'll just take maybe one or two questions. Okay. So.
Read.
Oh yeah.
After you read.
He wants to end with the reading, I believe. So I'll just take three. Maybe we'll take all the questions at once, and we'll try and answer them also.
Kanaga, you and Krishen collaborated on some writing, I think. I was thinking about maybe towards a mystical reality. I think you may have co-written things. When you were flatting together back in the old days in Oakland, California, you've said in your book, in one of your pieces of writing, that you were very much the art historian. He was the historian, but also he was there absorbing popular culture, watching lots of movies and so on. What I was just wondering is, when you did co-write on those occasions, how did you bring those two different sensibilities to bear as collaborators?
Okay, great. So there's a co-writing question here. So I'm just going to take all the questions due to time, then we'll answer them at one go.
What do you think is the hope or the role of an apprentice in your professions, as opposed to academic career paths? Secondly, what do you think is the role of museums and art galleries in the production and the promotion of artists, and whether you as historians or art critics would have a role in that. Thirdly, do you think that criticism can develop to a higher stage in the absence of, say, an architecture critic? In other words, if the criticism industry, can it progress if there are no other types of critics around as well? I think for a long time, Paul Johnson in the New York Times, who was an architecture critic, had a great influence on New York's landscape. So I'm wondering whether, as critics, whether other professions that also develop criticism would also give you a higher prominence.
Okay, and the last question, yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the talk. I just wanted to start by saying that I recently read an article on the BBC that claims that 2018 is the year of the critic-proof movie. So 2 movies the critics have slammed and made a lot of money. So it led me to think about the critic's influence and impact, right? And the authority that a critic will have in adjudicating taste and adjudicating trends and so on and so forth. But my question for you is, with new avenues of publication, right? Anybody can publish anything on social media and so on and so forth. The level of influence, the kind of critics or criticism that is floating about out there, what do you think is the challenge facing the critic where you have so much new media floating about and the whole going to the newspapers and the general journals where criticism used to flourish, right, are being challenged? So what do you think the challenges are for the critic in this time and day with the different modes of publication? Thank you.
The co-writing with Krishen, the one tangible outcome of such a collaboration occurred in the publication called Vision and Idea, Relooking Modern Malaysian Art. It was in 1995 or 96. And Krishen was, I think, persuaded to be part of the panel consisting of Piedasa and Zabas and myself. And the 3 of us put together that publication. And there was an exhibition component attached to it, which was given over to Zabas to be the curator. So the publication, the compass of the publication was far greater than the exhibition. Krishen was asked to write the introduction to that. And he and I huddled together a number of times, separately from the others, and sometimes over the telephone. And it's amazing, Helen, that you're right, how we almost naturally revived our relationship and our domicile in 665 Alcatraz Avenue in Berkeley, where we talked about these things. And Krishen leavened a far more flexible and sort of elastic way of writing. I was a bit more straight-laced. He was the one who included literary references, poetic references, mythological references in very subtle ways, which altered the tone and the tenor of the writing. Not just his introduction, but all of us, because I was the editor, and every time Krishen finished 3 paragraphs, I hastily distributed those paragraphs to the fellow writers and urged them to think of their writing in relation to these. So he brought to it a worldliness, which I think he was capable of carrying and conveying softly but effectively.
Kanaga, is it
Okay,
okay? if we
quickly, I
assume-
can't go on about it, yeah?
But actually, I'm going to say we can't answer the last 2 questions because the
Oh.
organizers are like breathing
Oh
literally
dear.
down my neck.
But
Yes.
can we, I'd like to
Can just do
speak
the final
about it
reading,
later
maybe?
on. This is Krishen on dance. On Ramli Ibrahim. The title, Foray into New Creations, published in 1991 in Talking Drama with Ute. It's quite a long piece. And then he says, transitory states, the next dance was something new for Ramli. For one thing, it had no story, but simply was the results of a situation that implanted dancers cavorting in the ambience of a studio. Also, the juxtaposition of, and this is great, minimalist music by Steve Reich and perambulations in Indian classic dance was uncommon. On reflection, though, the combination was not so weird, since minimalist music that repeats musical images with subtle variations is in part inspired by Asian music. So there he goes, soars into a grand historical generalization, which is highly valued today. But to see it exercised in Indian dance created the best sensation of the evening. Space was once again the most energetic center of the dance. Space was the most energetic center of the dance. How does one envisage that? An Indian classical dance, conquering space sometimes in a fast and furious manner, is a Ramli speciality that tells us much about the choreographer's intellectual and sensual control over the dance. And then comes the stab. Ramli was aiming for fluidity and would parallel that of Reich's music. Here, the mix of dancers of different ages and competencies was frustrating. Liquefaction, liquefaction by way of muting the hard edges of Indian dance could be essayed by Guna and Marvin Koo, but most of the rest were jagged in their attempts. It was frustrating because a profound dance idea could not really be fulfilled. The presence of children hobnobbing with adult dancers is fine when exploring the idea of joy and festivity in dance. Children can do things in dance that adults cannot, and Ramli has been exemplary in concretizing this artistic axiom. But when the dance is dependent on control, as in transitory states, then the presence of children can be defeating. He's unsparing. The dance is question was an example of choreography that touched and commented on the formalistic behavior of Indian classical dance. The realization of the idea and its conversion into a sensual event necessitated mastery of the dance. Thus realized it could stand proudly in any international arena of dance. This was not so. Now, here's an exemplary instance of the contingent being interspliced with grand historical traditions and then back again. Would I suggest you see this dance? Yes and no. That is mastery of language, I think. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.